Hallo? Hallo? Ja. Ja. Ja, jeg er Maria Oksum. Jeg sitter i hovedstyret. Og neste foredragsholder er Ysabella Hazan fra Montreal i Canada. Hun er jurist, taler og influencer med 40 000 følgere på Instagram, 50 000 på X og 20 000 på TikTok. Hun har i flere år, men særlig etter 7. oktober, stått i front i forsvar for Israel og i kampen mot antisemitisme. Please welcome Ysabella Hazan.
Good? Good. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for the very warm welcome here in Norway. I have to be honest. Coming to Norway for this lecture, I did not think I would be welcomed by Europe on the night of my arrival with the first pogrom in Europe since the Holocaust. On the anniversary of Kristallnacht, no less. But am I surprised? Unfortunately, I am not. The rhetoric on campuses and on the streets in Europe and in North America leave me not surprised that a pogrom has taken place in 2024. Just 2 nights ago, Jews, Israelis were hunted down, lynched and thrown into the river. They had knives pulled out on them by Palestinian freedom fighters, allegedly. The open season to hunt Jews in Amsterdam just 2 nights ago was made possible not only by the Free Palestine neo-Nazis who premeditated the attack, but also by the police who watched. Pogroms, anti-Jewish violence, and persecution were once a thing of the past, I thought, of history books. I'm going to be very vulnerable with you here today. And I'm going to tell you a question that every Jew has asked themselves in the past. I promise you that every single Jew has asked this question about their non-Jewish friends. They have asked, will they hide me? I am pleased to say that I am in a room with the exception and not the rule. I'm in a room with people who I know not only would hide a Jew, but you guys are here because you stand with the people of Israel and because you stand with Israel. So for that, I'm very grateful to be here today with you. Thank you. Because this generation of Jews, the people of Israel, are no longer interested in hiding. We have decolonized our land. We have returned back home. We are interested in thriving. So I'm very grateful to be here with those who support Israel, and it's a really great refresher for me because, just last week I spoke at Columbia University. Columbia University was the university that started the encampment movement, and today I'm welcomed by a very warm crowd, so thank you very much. Moving forward. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, we thought that many people would stand up and protect the Jews. However, we see that today the silence from the world is deafening. The same world that turned a blind eye to the Jews in the 1930s is the same silence that we're seeing today. Except today we have Israel. I'm privileged to be here with you, and I'm even more privileged to talk about a topic that is often misunderstood, but remains a cornerstone of modern history, the establishment of the State of Israel as a successful decolonization of the Jewish people and our ancestral homeland. For centuries, the people of Israel were dispersed, dispossessed, and denied sovereign rights in the land of our forefathers. Today, Israel stands as a powerful testament to the resilience of an indigenous people reclaiming self-determination in the historic land, overcoming centuries of foreign rule and oppression. As we explore this narrative that is not much talked about, we will see how the rebirth of Israel is not just a political story, but a profound act of justice, restoring a nation to its roots and re-establishing a cultural, spiritual, and national life where it belonged millennia ago. After 2,000 years, the Jewish people have rose from the ashes and are no longer a people for the history books. We have shown the world that the people of the book have begun a new chapter, returning home and decolonizing our ancestral and indigenous land. The Jewish story is one of resilience. In exile, we face persecution in every generation, in every corner of the globe. But our resilience is encrypted in our DNA. So today, I'm going to give some stories about diaspora and decolonization, because as you see, we are currently living through a pivotal moment in Jewish history. Jews, an ancient people who originate from the land of Israel after being forced into exile by the Romans, have successfully returned back home. The prayer on the water, of course. So before we begin, let's get into the meat and the bones of it. Who are the Jewish people? By a show of hands, who here says Jews are a religion, that Judaism is a religion? You think Judaism is a religion? Both? Okay. It could be two things, yeah. Anyone else think it's a religion? No, you guys are an educated crowd. You guys know. So as Jews, we don't fit into the taxonomies of our time. We don't fit into the boxes. Jews are not a religion. Because if we were a religion, then it would be that we fit into the taxonomies of our time, but also because if you don't believe in the Torah, you're still a Jew. If you accept Christ, if you accept Muhammad, if you follow the Quran, if you follow the Bible, you're either a Muslim or a Christian. But if you're a Jew and you don't follow the Torah, you're still a Jew. Because our identity is not just one of a belief system. We are an ancient people who originate from the land of Israel. Thank you. So when asked, who are the Jewish people? Who am I? And where are you from? That is a very deep question. So when people ask me where I am from, I answer that I am from Israel. I am the descendants of Jews who chose to preserve their Jewish identity, and because they risked their lives to be here, to stay connected to their traditions, to stay connected to Israel, that's why I am here. Our diaspora experience, although it had highs and it has lows, does not dictate where we are from. In 1000 BCE, Jerusalem was named the capital of Israel by King David. In 1960 BCE, the first temple, the national and spiritual center of Jewish life, was built in Jerusalem by King Solomon. In 1930, the kingdom of Israel split. It turned into Israel and to Judah. Later, Israel was crushed by the Assyrians, and then we have the 10 lost tribes that I wear on my neck all the time to remember that we are part of one collective. And the people split into the kingdom of Judah and the kingdom of Israel. That was when, in 586, Judah conquered by Babylonia, and the Jerusalem temple was destroyed, and most Jews were exiled to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar conquered Assyria, Egypt, and Judah, but his most famous conquest was that of Jerusalem. And why do I say this now? It is important to understand this in order to understand the Jewish roots to our land. Because why are Jews called Jews? Where does the word Jew come from? It comes from exactly that. Jews are called Jews because we are from the land of Judea. So why is Israel called Israel and not the land of Judea? Because the Jews that you know today are the remainders of the two tribes of Judah. It was their last place of sovereignty in Israel. And as a collective, 12 tribes, we are the people of Israel, the nation of Israel. That's also, again, why I wear the tribes on my neck. Moving forward, I want to discuss now that we understand the profound connection, ethnically and historically, of the Jews to the land of Israel, some of our indigenous practices and examples. So, one of the Jewish indigenous practices is a practice called Shemitah. Shemitah is a Jewish practice that can only be done in the land of Israel. Our culture revolves around... Oh, I was wondering who was speaking. It was the translator. Sorry, I was getting distracted. It was like in my ear. A fun fact, before I knew that my talk was going to be translated live, I learned some Norwegian words, so diaspora. That they heard. So going back to discussing some of the Jewish indigenous practices that are land-based, Shemitah is a practice of letting the land rest. After 7 years, we are no longer allowed to touch the fruits of the land. We have to respect the land, and that is one of our land-based practices. As Jews, every morning, 3 times a day, we pray towards Jerusalem. Wherever I am in the world, I know that wherever the sun rises in the east, I know that that's the direction that points to Jerusalem. And throughout every generation, Jews in the diaspora, even though we were exiled from our land by the Romans, a Jew can tell you where Jerusalem is by looking at the sunset and looking at the sunrise. That is another one of our practices that are rooted to the land. And here's another fun fact for you, another indigenous practice that we have that is land-based, challah. I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard about challah, and I'm sure a lot of you guys have even eaten challah. But where does the word challah come from? Challah is the word for the piece of the bread that we remove and that we give to the high priest in the temple times. In Hebrew, the word for bread is not challah, it is lechem. But the reason why we have challah on Shabbat is because weekly when we'd give pilgrimage to the temple in Jerusalem, we would give that part to the high priest. So even something as simple as challah is also a land-based practice, an indigenous practice of the Jewish people. And I think many people who have challah, maybe even some anti-Zionists, don't realize that they are supporting a Jewish indigenous practice by eating challah. Another way that we have stayed connected as an indigenous people to our land is in the year 210, we codified our oral law. The oral law was codified in the Mishnah. It was codified in the land of Israel. Like many indigenous people, we have an oral tradition. And thanks to our oral tradition being codified, we were able to survive thousands of years in the diaspora. Another one of our, I love this crowd. I'm going to give you my favorite revival of civilization. It is the holiday of Tu B'Av. It is one of the holidays that we almost lost in diaspora as an indigenous people because we are no longer able to celebrate it. It's a land-based holiday, similar to Shemitah, which is the practice of letting the land rest. Tu B'Av is the holiday where we celebrate the reconnection of Jews to the land of Israel. So many people confuse Tu B'Av to be the Jewish Valentine's Day, but that could not be further from the truth. Tu B'Av is a time on the 15th of Av, the Hebrew month of Av, where the people of Israel, the women of Israel, will go out into the vineyard of Jerusalem, all dressed in white, ready to find their husband. Well, that's a practice that was lost because the tribe of Benjamin was no longer allowed to intermarry with other tribes, but because the tribes were at risk, because the tribe of Benjamin was at risk of losing people, they were going down in numbers. There was the decree that was lifted to unite the Jewish people. The other tribe, the other fathers of the tribe said, you can now intermarry with the tribe of Benjamin, and that's why on the holiday of Tu B'Av we celebrate that. Another reason we celebrate Tu B'Av is because when the resistance fighters against the Romans were fighting off to protect the land of Jerusalem, our martyrs, our Hebrew fighters, our resistance fighters were not allowed to be buried. The Romans did not let us bury them. So for 13 years, they laid on the plains of Jerusalem, on the Judean hills. But on Tu B'Av, years later, that decree was lifted. And we don't just celebrate because the decree was lifted on Tu B'Av. It is because our sages tell us that the bodies remained intact. So now that we have the land of Israel to celebrate this holiday, we could honor first of all, the ban of intermarriage being lifted. We can honor the fact that our martyrs who were persecuted by the Romans and who survived and remained intact, we can celebrate that on our land. It's a holiday that we can only do in the land of Israel. Another example of a Jewish and indigenous practice to the land of Israel is literally all our holidays, because all of our holidays have to do with the pilgrimage festivals. We would go up and do Aliyat HaRegel. Aliyat HaRegel means to go up to the Temple Mount, to go up to what we call now the Temple Mount. We call Har HaBayit, what was the Beit HaMikdash, the temple. And once our temple was destroyed, the focal point for Jewish spirituality was destroyed. But we've maintained ways to preserve our indigenous practices, like the challah, for example, to honor the high priest in the temple. But here's another example, again, of how our practices as Jews, as an indigenous people, are land-based. Moving forward. I hope I'm not talking too quickly. I was told to talk slow. Too quick? I'll go down, slow down. Young, like live in Canada, we speak quickly. Okay. So now that we understand the Jewish connection to Israel and our land-based practices, let's dive deeper into the international law's definition, the UN's definition of what it means to be indigenous and how it applies to the Jewish people. So the United Nations defines indigenous peoples as those who have historical continuity with pre-invasion and pre-colonial societies that developed on their territories and who consider themselves distinct from other sectors of societies now prevailing on those territories or parts of those territories. Indigenous groups typically have a unique cultural, linguistic, and historical connection to a specific land, often through religion. As Jews, it is not a religion, it's our belief system, language, tradition, or ancestral lineage. Furthermore, these communities seek to maintain and develop their cultural identities, social structures, and relationship to their traditional territories. Now, using this definition, let's see how Jews meet the criteria of indigeneity to the region, now known as Israel, and the broader areas of ancient Israel. So first, going more in depth, the historical continuity and long-term connection. That is the first part of the definition, the UN definition. Archaeological and historical records confirm that Jewish civilization originated in ancient Israel over 3,000 years ago. The area was home to Jewish kingdoms and communities approximately during 1200 BCE to the Roman period. Jews maintained a continuous presence in this region. That's extremely important to note. When Jews revived our ancestral land, there was the old yeshuv that was there, and we had Rav Kook who was guarding it. So we've always maintained a constant presence in the land. That is extremely important to understand. Even though we were exiled, there is still a community of Jews who remained there, and also in every generation, a community of Jews who's tried to go back. So Jews maintain a continuous presence in the region, even under foreign rulers like the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Byzantines, the Islamic conquest, and the Ottomans. So despite these movements of forced exile and persecutions, we've continuously resided, particularly in places like Jerusalem, Tzfat, Tiberia, and Hebron. The second part of the definition, cultural and religious connection. Judaism is a belief system deeply intertwined with the land of Israel, with sacred texts like the Torah referencing it as not only the promised land, but recounting historical religious events that took place there. From a secular standpoint, whether or not people who don't believe in the Torah believe in this, as Jews, it is our mythology. We know that in Beit El, that is where Yaakov had his dream. We know that when we dig in the land, we find ancient artifacts. When I went to Beit El, I saw where the Maccabees had the revolts, ancient wineries, ancient wine presses, olive presses. We see the ancient agricultural practices. So this connection is, of course, undeniable. Next, part 3 of the definition of indigenous, of how Jews are indigenous to Israel, is the self-identification and distinct cultural identity. So Jews from Judea have obviously consistently identified themselves as a people with roots in Israel. Even the land of Israel is an essential tenet of Jewish identity. You cannot divorce Jews from Israel. Israel is named after us. We are named after Israel. It goes hand in hand. The preservation of Hebrew, an ancient language originating in the land of Israel, is continuously used in religious texts and reflects a strong ongoing connection to the land. And not only does it reflect a strong and ongoing connection to the land, the people of Israel have revived this language and spoken it colloquially. I'll give you an example of how we've also kept to preserve this language. I'm sure many of you have heard of Yiddish, correct? But I think less of you have heard of Chakatia. Khakatia is a Jewish Creole, a Jewish language that was spoken in Tanger, where my mother is from. Sorry to call you out my mom. She's my momager. And it is... She's going to kill me, but I'm so grateful to her. So Khakatia is a mixture of Spanish, Arabic, and Hebrew. It is a type of Creole. So no matter where Jews were, we see that there was Yiddish, Ladino, Khakatia, and different languages that still kept Hebrew. And Khakatia is actually written with Hebrew letters. So even as we were displaced from Israel, and even though we kept our religious texts in Israel, we prayed in Hebrew, we still maintained in the diaspora a unique way to preserve our language. That is something that was very difficult. And actually, very interestingly, on the panel that I was with last week, it was a panel with Indigenous people. They were talking about how they could preserve their language. And it goes to show that Zionism is we'll get into that later, but one of the most successful decolonization movements because we've managed to maintain our language for thousands of years. So next, part of the definition of what it means to be indigenous according to the United Nations is a desire to maintain and reestablish a connection with the ancestral land. So throughout history, Jews expressed a longing to return to their ancestral land in Israel through prayer, through literature, communal spaces. This desire is central to Jewish identity and communal life. This was culminated in the waves of the many aliyahs. Aliyah means to move to Israel, and it comes from the Hebrew word la'alot, to go up. And many Jews throughout the centuries have attempted to go to Israel, some in fractured movements, but the connection was never lost. Every Passover we say, next year in Jerusalem. Every morning we pray, towards Jerusalem. It is a central tenet. So the fourth point, to desire and maintain a connection with the ancestral land, has always been maintained. Actually, there was 12 documented movements, I'll speak about some of them later, to return to Israel. But the movement that we know about is Zionism, because Zionism has succeeded. Next, this one is interesting, because this is part of the UN's definition, and perhaps not part of most indigenous people's definition of what it means to be indigenous. So this part is about a historical displacement and a loss of sovereignty. Jews experienced displacement, particularly during the Roman rule, when large numbers were expelled following revolts. This displacement, of course, as mentioned, did not sever Jewish identity from the land, as Jewish communities contained a continuous presence and regularly undertook pilgrimages, along with preserving a strong cultural attachment to Israel. Given these factors, many scholars, including those indigenous studies scholars, deduce and understand that Jews meet the criteria to be indigenous to the land of Israel. This brings me to the Jewish liberation movement. Jews have created the most successful indigenous liberation movement of our time, Zionism. Yet, there's a problem and an incongruence between this indigenous decolonization movement and the UN's definition. Because the last definition of the UN, as stated, is a historical displacement and a loss of sovereignty. So what does this mean? Do you have to have a loss of sovereignty in order to be indigenous? What happens when indigenous people return to our land? What happens when a movement like Zionism comes about and the Jews return home, build kibbutzim? What happens to that? We're no longer indigenous? This is a problematic part of the definition in the UN definition, and this will bring me later to how it goes into us decolonizing our land. It is highly problematic because what happens when indigenous people return? Do indigenous people have to be oppressed in order to be indigenous? Of course not. So, giving my talk about decolonizing Jewish identity and returning back home, the definition of what it means to be indigenous into the UN also needs to be decolonized. It also needs to be said according to indigenous people and defined by indigenous people, including Jews. So next, this brings me into Zionism. Zionism is a movement founded by Herzl, and to give a brief definition of what Zionism is the belief, movement, or ideology that Jews have the right to self-determination in the land of Israel. So if you break down Zionism, it's really two-pronged. Number one, that Jews have rights to live in the land of Israel, and the Jews have rights, and two, to live in the land of Israel. So it's very simple. Jewish right to self-determination, second part, in the land of Israel. That's really all it is. There was many different kinds of Zionists. There was, cultural Zionists like Achad Ha'am. One of my favorite quotes by him is, "More than the Jews have kept Shabbat, Shabbat has kept the Jews." And this goes to speak also on the points of cultural preservation. So just moving forward. So Zionism is the movement that successfully decolonized the land of Israel. That's what decolonization looks like for the Jewish people. But I'm going to go more into depth onto that now. So what is decolonization? How does it look for the nation of Israel? And let's get into it. So decolonization has historically occurred in waves, especially after the Second World War, when many African and Asian Caribbean nations gained independence. In a contemporary context, decolonization can also refer to efforts within societies to dismantle colonial influences in culture, in education, in governance, and other spaces and aspects of public life. Even in countries where formal political independence was achieved, there are still other ways to to achieve decolonization through other efforts, like cultural efforts or educational efforts. It looks different for every kind of people. For the Jewish people, it looks like being sovereign in our land and being the authors of our future. And you know what? The journey has just begun. So decolonization is at its heart about reclaiming freedom and dignity. It is the process by which nations and communities, once controlled by outside powers, work to gain full independence and rebuild their own image. So decolonization isn't just about political sovereignty or drawing new borders. It's about removing lasting remarks of colonialism on every part of life. At a political level, decolonization means a people finally having the right to decide their own government, set their own laws, and control their own resources. Economically, it means standing on their own feet, free from systems that once exploited their land and labor for benefit of a distant power. But decolonization goes deeper too. It's about restoring cultures, it's about restoring languages and traditions that were silenced or suppressed. It's about reconnecting with what was lost. It's about education, replacing colonial histories with the true stories of the people and the places. For example, when the Greeks conquered the land of Israel, they tried to put their idols into our temple. So we see that throughout many waves of history, Jews have faced colonization in the land of Israel, but also outside of the land of Israel on a mental level. So it's about addressing the long-standing inequalities and injustices and wounds left behind by colonial rule. In a more modern context, the process of decolonizing Israel specifically, or more accurately, the re-establishment of the State of Israel, was the end of the British colonial rule in the region. This was a complex and multifaceted struggle shaped by historical, political, and also social dynamics. We see the armed struggle via the Lehi fighters, the Haganah, the Etzel. We see the diplomatic efforts by the Jewish Agency. This was a long struggle through many fronts. This process cannot be understood solely through the modern lens of decolonization, because of course this is a modern concept. So I like to frame it as deprogramming or unprogramming, or undoing layers that are not belonging to the locals of the land. I think that's a simpler way to view it. So understanding the modern notion of decolonization, which typically refers to the formal end of colonial rule over a territory, most recently for Israel, the British. However, it can also be understood as the culmination of efforts to reestablish Jewish sovereignty in their ancestral land after centuries of foreign domination. So of course we liberated the land from the British, but before that there were many empires that were there, and it's important to know that every empire that colonized or that came to conquer the land of Israel never had Jerusalem as its capital. Only the nation of Israel had Jerusalem as its capital. So, on that note, I will share some stories. I will share some struggles in diaspora and resistance in the homeland of Israel. These are examples that this can be a lecture of its own, the Jewish resistance in the land of Israel. It could be an entirely separate lecture. As we know, as I mentioned before, there are at least 12 documented movements for Jews attempting to return to the land of Israel. Of course, as I mentioned, Zionism is the one that succeeded, so that is the one that we know. But I'll begin with naming a few. So one of these resistance movements was the Maccabean revolt in the year 167 BCE to 160 BCE. This is one of the earliest revolts and the most famous examples of Jewish resistance against the Seleucid Empire. There was the Great Jewish Revolt in the year 66 to 73, Common Era. This was an armed uprising of the Jews against the Romans in the province of Judea, against Roman rule. This resistance movement was led by the Zealots. Another very famous resistance movement that attempted to regain sovereignty to decolonize the land of Israel was the Bar Kokhba revolt. The Bar Kokhba revolt took place in 132 to 136 CE. This revolt was another significant uprising against the Romans again, and it was led by Shimon Bar Kokhba. Another example of Jewish resistance was during the Crusades in 1096 to 1272. And I can go on and on and on through 2,000 years. I think every single year, Jews attempted to liberate our land, whether it was big or small. So of course, we can go on. But now I'm going to go into a list of Jewish resistance through the fighters, through resistance fighters. I'll tell you the story through them. And I'll start with the first Jewish resistance example that I gave, which was of the Maccabean revolt. And I'm going to tell you the story of the first Maccabee, the Maccabee who ignited the revolt. And her name was Miriam the Maccabee. Miriam was the first to protest the Greeks' occupation law that ordered Jewish women to spend a night with the Greek governor before their wedding. This was a practice that occurred while the Greeks conquered our land. The night before Miriam's wedding feast, before the weddings lasted a long period of time, it was like a week. So the night before her wedding feast, Miriam did something that no one of her time would do. Miriam stripped naked before the entire community. She protested the oppressive Greek law in our land. Her brothers threatened to kill her. And she told them, "You are angry at me? Channel your anger to the Greeks who are ruling over our land, who are having this oppressive rule that forced Jewish women to spend a night with the head of the Greek army instead of channeling your anger towards me." Miriam the Maccabee was the catalyst for the fierce Maccabean revolt. I will give another example of a resistance fighter, more recent. His name is Moshe Barzani. Moshe was a freedom fighter for the Lehi, the freedom fighters for Israel. Moshe Barzani was sentenced to death for having found a grenade on him. He was sentenced to death by the British. He was not the first Jew fighting to liberate our land from the British colonial rule who was sentenced to death, but I'm going to read you one of his quotes. This is a quote from Moshe Barzani on his trial from March 17, and he refused to comply with the British colonial rule in the land. He refused to get a lawyer. He refused to follow within their system. He wanted to break free from the system that did not belong in the land. So to read you his quote, Moshe Barzani said before being executed in Israel, "The Hebrew nation sees in you an enemy, a foreign regime in our country. We, the fighters for the freedom of Israel, are waging a war against you in order to free our land. In this war, I have fallen your prisoner, and you have absolutely no right to judge me. You will not frighten us with hangings. You will not succeed in breaking us. My people and all peoples oppressed by you will fight until the empire is destroyed." That is a quote from Moshe Barzani before being executed. There's a great movement called Vision. They're leading the conversation on the post-colonial conversation in Israel. and it's from an article called A Grenade Between Two Hearts. Goes to show the powerful resistance of these young fighters during the British colonial rule. And the reason I'm going to emphasize on the British is because that is the most recent imperial power in the land of Israel that we were liberated from. So on September 27th, 1947, Britain announced that it would officially be terminating its mandate for Palestine on May 14, 1948. On that day, the British finally published a white paper. And in this white paper, the reason that the British gave for leaving the land is that the British credited the Jewish underground fighters for forcing the empire to leave the British mandate of Palestine. Later, the London Sunday Times, a newspaper in England, confirmed this white paper and wrote the following, and I quote, "If any one event forced us to leave Israel and permit the Jews to create a state, it was a defiant resistance of these young Jews who were led to the gallows. It may be said that after 2,000 years, the Jewish state rose again on the broken necks of those who mounted on to the gallows." And now, I want to tell you about another resistance fighter. This resistance fighter's name is Alexandre Luc. Alexandre Luc is a member of my community back in Montreal. So yes, even though the Jews have decolonized our land, and we've revived our language, and we've preserved our culture, we still have resistance fighters. Alexandre Luc, like Tomer, who is here in the crowd today, was at the Nova Festival. Alexandre Luc, once he saw the Hamas terrorists invading Israel, coming to a party where people were celebrating peace, dancing, living life, he decided to put his life on the line. And when there was a grenade that was thrown at him and through his friends, he jumped in front of it and he saved countless Israeli lives that day. I'm touched because sometimes I say this story and it's not always, well received. Especially because I know Alexandre's mother and she's going to see them clapping. Oh my God. I see Alexandre's mother, Raquel. Raquel is a true lion of Zion. She is also a fighter. And she goes and she tells the story of her son wherever she gets the chance. She spoke on the parliament, she spoke on the news, and she's still fighting for her son's story to be understood. And thank you. So Alexandre Luc is a freedom fighter of our generation. So we still have them, and whether it was Miriam the Maccabee, Moshe Barzani, or Alexandre Luc, these are three people among thousands of liberation fighters for the liberation of Israel that, thanks to them, I am here. Thanks to them, Jewish civilization has survived. So we honor them and all of the many Jewish fighters who have helped to decolonize our land, and Alexandre Luc to maintain our land. So now that we have unpacked the struggles of decolonization and Zionism, how it is a liberation movement, how it's about our sovereignty in the land of Israel, and how the Jews have liberated our land from the British, let us discuss other elements of decolonization and deprogramming. I'll begin by saying why it's so important, especially to me as a Jew. Decolonization of Jewish identity, it has a direct consequence on how we view the conflict and how the conflict is perceived and how we will achieve peace and justice in the land that I am from. I started a movement called Decolonized Judean. Decolonized Judean is all about reclaiming Jewish identity. It's about viewing the Jewish story from a Jewish lens. It's about deprogramming and undoing. It means going back to see who we are, connecting to our roots. So when someone asks a Jew where they're from, they'll answer proudly, I am from Israel. I grew up in Montreal, but I'll always know where I am from. So before you guys tell me, Ysabella, so wait, are you telling me that you want Jews to go live in tents and walk in the desert like an Israelite and go back to the old times? No, that's not what I'm saying by decolonizing Jewish identity. To decolonize specifically means to view Jewish identity from a Jewish lens. That's what it means. That we get to determine our future. That we get to be the authors of our future. Many of our practices have changed, have evolved, have been assimilated. I'll go into some of those later on. So decolonized Judean is also, and the movement for it, and the importance of decolonizing our identity, and also as allies for you to understand how you can support us in this, is because we need to have a cultural shift around the narrative of how people talk about Israel on and offline. With 2,000 years of exile, the Jewish people have faced oppression, have faced colonization in many different forms. We have faced spiritual, mental, and physical colonization. We have to admit that after 2,000 years, my family's diaspora experience was being a dhimmi. A dhimmi is a second-class citizen. To say the word citizen is very generous. We had to pay an extra tax, a jizya tax. We were not allowed to have synagogues that were higher than a mosque. We weren't allowed to wear certain clothing. And actually, as a way to humiliate us, we weren't allowed to cover our hair. We weren't allowed to have specific head coverings. And what a lot of people don't know is the idea of a yellow star didn't originate with the Nazis, this concept of wearing yellow to demarcate Jews. It started in the Middle East and North Africa. So whether it was the Mina experience, or whether it was the Jews who had to live in shtetls, the Jews have faced a lot of mental colonization, a lot of influences that have forced us to practice differently. And also it has, in consequences, naturally affected the way that we view ourselves. I will give a personal example of how I've decolonized an aspect of my Jewish identity. So for those of you who are here at the conference who I've gotten the honor of meeting and speaking with, you've probably noticed I have a hard time keeping kosher here. But we manage. I always kept kosher. I never ate unkosher meat. I never mixed meat and milk. I always kept kosher traditionally. But when I was in my Hebrew class, I was learning from my professor, More Fima, an excellent professor, and he was telling us the story of the Jews in Spain. And he was explaining to us that the Jews had a choice during the Inquisition. The choice was to eat pork, to die, or to leave. And when I was, 14, 15, hearing this, it really marked me. Because I thought, before my ancestors were exiled from Israel, they had a long trajectory in Europe, in Spain, in Morocco, even Brazil. My mom recently found my great-grandmother's passport from Brazil. I thought, I am the descendants of Jews who made a choice. They made a choice to leave, to risk their lives, to cross into Morocco, to protect their covenant, to protect their identity. And in honor of them, how can I not keep the highest level of kosher? So that is why I started keeping a higher level of kosher. I will only eat something that has a hechsher. Here in Europe, you guys don't believe in hechshers so much, so that has been hard. But I will only eat something that has a hechsher, and I will maintain a higher level. Okay, fine. That's good. But this was not good enough, and I'll tell you why. The reason why I started keeping kosher on a higher level was not because of my Jewish identity. It was not because of my practices as an indigenous person. To put it simply, it was because of the inquisitors. Had the inquisitors not given my ancestors this option, then maybe I would be eating a pizza, maybe I'd be eating more normally. And this is a process that I took, and it's a deep process to decolonize because it got me thinking. It was very hard for me socially to not go to restaurants anymore. It was getting more difficult. And in order to sustain myself in this commandment, in this mitzvah, I said, I need to learn more. Because it's been a few years I'm doing this, it's getting hard, but it's not being enjoyable at this point. And I like to do things with intentions. I like to lead with what I call the 4 Alephs: light, emunah, faith, ahava, love, and emet, truth. So keeping kosher was, because of the inquisitors, was most definitely not aligned with any of those. So I dug deeper. And now the reason that I keep kosher is because I want to uplift and add a light to whatever it is that I eat. I want to make a blessing to something very animalistic. I want to make it more pure. I want to create an angel when I speak. I want to do it the way that my ancestors done, not because they were persecuted, but because they preserved our traditions regardless of the persecution. And this goes to show you how decolonizing Jewish identity is integral to how we view ourselves as Jews, because let's say now a lot of us consider the war of 1948. Israel won that war, right? Right? But did we win that war? Or did we just survive? Because Zionism, Zion, what does Zion mean? Jerusalem. How did we consider winning a war where we didn't have Zion? The Zionist movement won a war without Zion. We confused survival for victory. And that is why, just a personal example, I can give you many more, of why it is extremely important for Jews to view ourselves from our lens. And I will go into more examples of that later on. I think I'm good for time, right? 10 more minutes. 10 more minutes? Okay, so I'll make it faster. They're like, don't make it faster, please. That has so much to say. So with that said, talking about mistakes in how we view ourselves, I'll skip to an example of the greatest mistake in Zionist education. The greatest mistake in Zionist education is when we call Israel a safe haven for the Jewish people. Sure, Israel may be safe for Jewish people, but that is not why the Jews have Israel. That is not why many Jews have returned to Israel after October 7th. October 7th was objectively not safe for Jews and Israelis in Israel, yet how do you explain the phenomenon of more Jews returning to Israel after October 7th? Because Israel is not a safe haven for the Jewish people. Israel is the land for which we are from, and the only land in which we can actualize our mission as a people. So when we talk about decolonizing, it's also how we decolonize our liberation movement. And the way we do that, and I'll fast forward to some examples within our PR practices that I think is going to be very important, because we're all here to, of course, stand with Israel, but also effectively advocate for Israel. So I will mention a few practices that I think that we can shift and decolonize and undo. And I'll start by saying the ones that you guys have all probably heard. Are you ready? The West is next. Chickens for KFC. Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. You know what all these slogans have in common? They do not speak to young people. They do not speak about us, the Jewish people, or address the rhetoric and the serious accusations that we are facing on the world stage. And thirdly, and most dangerously, they indirectly prove exactly what the enemies of Israel are trying to accuse us of being: a Western outpost in the Middle East and a settler colony. I'll start with the West is next because I'm speaking to a European audience. You guys know more than me that the West is next. I don't need to explain that. But what I will explain is that you shouldn't stand with Israel because the West is next. You should stand with Israel because standing with Israel is the right thing to do. I hear a lot of times speakers and people within the movement try to make connections based on our similarities. And that's why they say the West is next. But of course we have similarities. But when we universalize the Jewish story and we don't look at it for its particularism, let's admit, the Jewish people, we are weird. We have survived thousands of years. We are not a religion. We are not an ethnic group. We are not the same. We're not. And when I see people make this argument of we are the same, I see people make this argument to an American audience, to a European audience. I see Moroccan Jews do it to a Moroccan audience. Are Moroccans and Norwegians the same? I don't know. Maybe there's similarities. But when we try to make the case for Israel by showing that it's just like us, we are saying that Israel is not a unique place and that Israel's right to exist depends on protecting the West is next. Yes, of course we're allies. Yes, of course we stand together, but we stand together based on shared values. And that is very different. And that is also why we're losing a lot of young people. Because when we're telling people that the West is next and that's why you should stand for Israel, what are we saying? We're saying that because Israel's protecting you, you should stand with Israel. That sounds very transactional for me. And if we haven't noticed yet, the next generation of young people on campuses are not transactional. They're very idealistic, they're very humanistic, and it would be such a shame for us to lose the next generation when the Jewish people have successfully decolonized our land, the most successful liberation movement of our time. Over what? Mislanguaged. Poor PR. So with that, I leave you with hopefully some food for thought. And I'd like to thank you again for having me. And let's open it up to questions. Thank you. Yeah?
Thanks a lot. We already got a few questions, and there are not time for more before lunch.
Sorry.
But there will be more time afterwards. Could you please explain some of the ways Jews in Morocco and other countries in North Africa maintain their Jewish identity through centuries of Arab occupation?
So Morocco is a very interesting example. A lot of people like to quote how the King of Morocco protected the Jews in the Holocaust. So I just want to say that history is not linear. Of course, we are grateful to him for that. But I would like to emphasize specifically for Morocco is that Moroccan Jews arrived to Morocco before the Islamic conquest. The Jews of Morocco have been here before the Arabs. The Jews were living amongst the Amazigh, the indigenous people, and many ways in which we've preserved our culture was by preserving our language. And Morocco was very blessed to have and to be a hotspot of Jewish mystics. My great-grandfather times 6 was Rav David Saba. He was the Grand Judge of Marrakesh. Morocco was a leader in Jewish writing, literature, poetry, and we followed our sages throughout the time. We followed people like my great-grandfather times 6, the Diana Marrakesh. We had so many tzaddikim, righteous people as we call them, like Baba Sali, some of you guys may know. So Morocco was very blessed to have a very strong Jewish leadership. And of course, like every other Jew in the diaspora, whether it was the Jews who were under Islamic rule or the Jews in the Middle Ages, we preserved our identity by keeping our practices. Some Jews would light the candles. I know in Spain in private. Today there's still stories of Jews in Spain who light their candles in cupboards and they just don't know why. And they don't even identify as Jewish anymore. So by staying connected to our practices that originate from the land of Israel, and also I wanted to mention the Mishnah, which was codified, our oral law. We believe that this law was given to us at the same time as the Torah through Moses, and without this law being codified, we would not be able to survive.
Another question, can you tell more about the 10 lost tribes of Israel? Who are they, where are they, and are they present in Israel today?
I love this question so much. I have a friend, his name is Rudy. Rudy Rockman, he started a movement, a project, a documentary series called We Were Never Lost. And it's called We Were Never Lost because the 10 tribes of Israel know that they are here. And we think that they lost them, but they've maintained their identity. So to answer your question, There's tribes of Israel all throughout Africa, in Asian countries. There's the 10 tribes of Gad, Zvulun, Menashe, Ephraim. All of these tribes, they still exist. There is the Lemba tribe. There is most notably the Igbo tribe in Nigeria. A lot of Jews from Igbo land still maintain a lot of their practices. I was listening to a video yesterday where some Jews, some lost tribe Jews, in order to not be persecuted, they changed the date of their circumcision. Instead of it being after 8 days, they would do it at 8 years old, because somebody who's 8 years old knows well enough to not show the private parts to people, and because people would check to see who was a Jew and who wasn't. The question of the 10 tribes is very complicated, and I really hope to see more efforts, and I support the effort of my friend Rudy Rockman. I suggest you all check it out. It's called We Were Never Lost, and God willing, we will all be back in Israel. Good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. We will go to have lunch now and meet again in 1 hour. Vi møtes igjen om 1 time, klokken 1:30. Da ble det konferansens nest siste foredrag med Ysabella. Så raskt til lunsj og raskt tilbake, dere som har forhåndsbestilt. Og dere som ikke har forhåndsbestilt, dere kan bruke den jødiske praksisen å faste. Eller kjøpe